Recording. I've been asked uh, to speak a little, or not a little, really, because I never speak a little. And specifically, or more importantly, for this topic, it is very hard to speak just a little or shortly on situations like this. So I'm going to talk a little, or a lot, um, about my. I don't want to say conversion experience because I believe I was a Christian, but it's more as a transition to Lutheranism. So my transition from Calvinism to Lutheranism. And again, I have no notes. I had some papers back there in the library. I wanted to write a few things out, but you know what? And here's my struggle. Here why I think it's difficult to talk about these things properly because it is a very subjective experience. It can be a very subjective experience. Truth is truth. There's no denying to that. But truth hits us in different ways. Not everybody experiences truth or comes to truth in the same way or gets hit by truth in the same way, and context, and it all depends on many, many factors, in my opinion. And of course, whether you are a Calvinist or if you are a Lutheran, at the end of the day, even Roman Catholics and Greek Orthodox, at the end of the day, we're all Christians. Whether it's, and I know that there are going to be differences and infights, and some people go a little extreme and start questioning other people's and traditions, salvation and orthodoxy and what else. And so I understand that. I realize that. I'm not going to pretend that these differences don't exist. They do exist. They are important. And in in each camp is going to be of the opinion that there are certain errors that can lead to bigger errors that can kind of jettison you out of Christianity. So I understand that. But of course, I am convinced, um, not only in a personal subjective level, but in I believe, an objective level, that Calvinism presents many problems. But I'm not going to speak on that on this precise episode or video. I'm going to try to make this video into, or parse this video or this experience, this topic, into perhaps 2 or 3 videos. And hopefully I'm not going to exceed 15 minutes in each, but we'll just see how it goes. I already spent 4 minutes, so there you go. And so I think that to properly put this into a context and be effective, I think it's important to talk about my upbringing, my country, and what I was surrounded with, and so forth. And so here we go. So as you guys know, or most of you know, and if you didn't know, now you know, like Biggie Small says. I'm a Panamanian, so that's, Central America. My first language, as as you would know, if you are into geography, history, and well versed in culture and things like this, our first language is Spanish. And so obviously my first language is Spanish, but Panama is being influenced by a lot of cultures by the sheer factor that it's a little isthmus. And in this isthmus, we have the Panama Canal. So the Panama Canal, for the building of this big old project, which is one of the 7th or 8th wonders in the world, they needed hands to build it, obviously. And so a lot of people took the opportunity from different countries to come and help. And so my grandfather, my great grandfather, was Jamaican, and on the other side he was from Barbados, and so they came from the Caribbean. Obviously they speak English, and my grandmother would speak English to me, and so forth. And they of course introduced me, or introduced the family. They bring their Baptistic, Methodist religion views, Christianity, with them to the country. So that's important. But the other factor to mention is that Panama is very, very Catholic, like Roman Catholic. And so I would say we are 85, 90% of the no, more like 85%. 85% of the population would auto-denominate themselves as Roman Catholic. And then there's another huge section that it's more into they will call themselves evangelicals. But, within the evangelical world, obviously there are some, there are the Baptists and the charismatics and so forth and so on. And then the rest are more into the kind of the sects, the heretical kind of stuff, like the, Jehovah's Witnesses, the Adventists, and there's a few Greek Orthodox, but those are like really, really the minority. It's not even a number to contemplate, and they don't really have any say in the culture. They are not really involved. I don't think they care to. And then, of course, there's a group of Indians, like Hindus, and then Muslims, little Muslims, but they're obviously on the more mellow side. There's no such thing as, radicalism or things in Panama. It's not, we haven't encountered or suffered anything like that at all. So we are a very peaceful country, sometimes to our to our chagrin, but it is important to understand that. So I grew up in a family where we were Baptists, and so my father was a deacon, a Baptist deacon, very faithful. To this day, he's still alive. Praise be to God. Both of my parents are alive, even though they are divorced, and that's what I grew up in. And so I made a profession of faith when I was 12 years old. And then I remember being in this camp with my brother, and this guy, it was a preacher who was not I don't think he's not a Christian anymore. He's not a Christian anymore. And he lives he did some very bad things. He was hitting his wife and cheating on his wife and this kind of thing. So, he's not a Christian anymore. He just doesn't identify as a Christian anymore. But I remember going with my brother being baptized, and my brother today is not a Christian because of certain things that happen in our family life, the legalism and that kind of thing from my parents, which is obviously soul destructive and discouraging and just annoying and all those things. If you want to jettison your kids out of Christianity, just be a legalist. Just be a non-grace-based family, church or whatever, and people are just, the burden is just too heavy, and that's just the way it is. But by the grace of God, so I've always had a heart for God. I always was the kid. So when my mother would ground me, they would throw me in this little room in our house, and my punishment was to read for example, Ecclesiastes or the book of Proverbs and whatnot. That will be my assignment, my punishment, and to read summaries. And, to me it was enjoyable because I've always enjoyed reading the Bible. I've always been a reader. In school, my favorite subjects were not only physical education, but also anything that had to do with literature, Spanish, English, and whatnot. So that's just the way I was wired. And so I've always had a heart for God in that sense. But I remember being in this, they used to call it new believers class. After you got baptized. And I remember having a lot of questions regarding my salvation, my assurance of salvation. Till this day, man, I still remember being always afraid and not having nightmares, sweaty hands and sweaty palms, thinking about my salvation, whether God loved me or not, because I fell into sin. So some kids introduced me into, pornography and things like this, and, all that comes around with that. But they were more like sexually active. I was more into the pornography side, and that always haunted me. And I always questioned my salvation. And obviously, later on down in life, the Lord saved me and delivered me from all that stuff. But um, so I always wondered, and I would remember going to these classes and asking the Deacon Antonio Morales. I still remember his name. He passed 4 years ago. He was a guitar player, very intellectual. He was a professor at the University of Panama, local university. So he was, he was good. But I remember raising my hands in that class and asking questions. How do you know that if you're saved, or I struggle with this, and always being pushed aside. And this is not a one-time experience. It also happened when I was an older man, and going to these conferences and asking questions because of by then I'm skipping obviously, but by then when I was an older guy, you in your mind, you have the Ordo Salutis kind of thing with Calvinism, and in the way that they explain certain things, I always had questions about this and that, and I remember perhaps it's something about our culture that we're not really that deep into understanding intellectually or historically explaining things. That may be a situation. I doubt it, because I have friends back in Panama now that are Lutherans, and they have talked to me about how their pastors would catechize them and teach them, and they've had questions. But again, I'm skipping the story. But I remember having those doubts and nobody really having an answer, until, by the grace of God, when I was, I want to say 19, 20 years old, I was in college back in Panama. This is way before I came to America. And a friend of mine introducing me to Charles Spurgeon's sermons. And obviously, Spurgeon was a Calvinist. And he brought me this sermon. He printed it out for me. And the sermon was about the perseverance of the saints, and also about grace, something about grace. And I remember, to this day, it was like I remember it as being a balm to my soul, because of, learning that it was not about me, which is back then in the Baptist churches, and I still to this day, this is just part of their theology, is to push you to do more things. So you have to work harder. It was pretty much a works-based religion, salvation, sanctification. And so there was no, what's the word I'm looking for? There was no comfort. There was no assurance. There was no guarantee of anything. It was all try the best you can, son, and see how it goes. And of course, that doesn't work. And so I remember reading these sermons and being so happy and grace. And I went through my cage stage and all that stuff, getting online. Back then, the internet was not so big as it is now, so we had dial-up in our home. I don't think Facebook was around, but I do remember getting into forums and getting into arguments with friends, and just binge buying books from A.W. Pink and John Flavel and Benjamin Keach. I read stuff from, later on I went to a little academy in the Dominican Republic, and we stayed there. So it was a bunch of guys from different countries. There was a guy from Peru, I was from Panama, two guys from Colombia, a bunch of Latin American countries. And we were introduced, and again, this is a Reformed Baptist element or environment. And we were introduced to books from Sproul, everything in Spanish, Sproul, Piper, and all these guys. And so I went through so I was, well knowledgeable about theology back then. But something happened 2 years ago. And of course, again, I apologize because I might be jumping back and forth, and in the next episode, I might be referring to some things in the past and whatnot. Again, there's no script to this. It's just my experiences, and I hope there's there's a mingling of the subjective aspect also with the objective aspect of it all. And so that was good. That was good. And I got into a lot of trouble because when my parents discovered, I remember being in the kitchen with my mother, and I always share different things of the Bible. I remember this was 13 years old, and wondering how can God judge certain people groups that have never heard of the gospel and things like that, how it would go. And then, of course, I read the book of Romans. I was trying to figure out, and it seems to me that the Bible would say that if you don't know of Jesus, that you will be judged upon, I guess, the law that's written in our hearts. And that was a tip. As you can tell by now, it's still a topic that I don't fully understand. I do understand the importance of missions and whatnot, but it's not a topic that I fully understand and dominate. But so those are the discussions that I would have with my mom. And of course, I just caught her by surprise. She didn't necessarily have all the answers, but I'm just giving you my context. And I remember when I was 18, 19 years old, creating a lot of havoc in my it wasn't havoc, but creating a lot of perhaps concern in my parents, because I started saying like Jesus didn't die for everybody, which is obviously a Calvinistic just mantra, election, predestination, and all these things. That God died for the elect, and of course they got scared, and it was so bad, and that they literally kicked me out of the house. And I was, gung ho. I really believe what I believe, and so I had to go and move into the little church that we were members of. Well, by that time, my parents were not attending that church anymore because of some things that had happened with my dad and my mom. But that's another long story. But so I had to move into the little apartment that they had in the church, and I had a job. I was paying my monthly rent and whatnot, and having conversations with the pastor, and just getting deeper and deeper into Calvinism. But this time I'm always a Reformed Baptist. That will be the label that I will give myself. And so, kicked out and all those things. But a big change happened when one of the guys that I used to pastor him. So I was a co-pastor with a friend of mine after I came from the Dominican Republic, and we left the church that I was living at. Had some issues there, but it was more a moral thing that was going on with the pastor and the leadership over there, and some fragmentation that happened because of the government style that they had. They still wanted to dominate the pastor. And if you're a Baptist, you know what I'm talking about. In the basic fundamentalist type of Baptist churches, the church is run by by committees or by the deacons. So it's like the pastor is not, the man of God doesn't really, at the end of the day, doesn't have a say, so to speak, because of the deacons and the most prominent people in the church tell the men what to do. And of course, it's very hard to talk about this because there are so many types of Baptists and there are so many types of Calvinists, which is I'm going to talk about more in the next episode, hopefully, that it's hard to pin down and really know what was going on. But so that was happening. So there were some issues going there. And we started this church with this friend of mine that also came out of this environment. And we lasted for 2.5 years, 3 years. And that was before I came to America. And my friend went back to his country. He's from Chile, but he had lived in Panama with us for 20 something years. So now he's back over there in Chile. And so one of the guys that came out of that ministry, we had a little WhatsApp group. WhatsApp is an app. And so I used it to stay in touch with my friends back in Panama and Colombia and all these countries that I know people from. And he confronted me. He said, Alfredo, you know that you cannot call yourself reformed if you don't baptize your babies? And that got me like, what? So this started spinning my wheels. And so I started listening to stuff from Sproul. He had a debate with MacArthur. It's on YouTube. I think Sproul beat him handily, but he came across to me as way more informed, a more robust understanding of history and scripture of the Old Testament. I think he demonstrated that baptism is not a thing that just that we can only analyze based off of the New Testament and Billy Graham. Like, Christianity has existed for a long time, and all these concepts are being borrowed from the Old Testament, and there's a lot of information out there. I thought he beat him handily. And then I started Third Millennium Ministries. The name of the president is Richard Pratt. And he had a video, or has a video, that he did a long time ago explaining those concepts. And I was like, well, just an eye opener. It was like, what? How did I ever see this? And then after months of studying and watching all these things, I became a Presbyterian. And my wife was kind enough to join me a couple times in a Presbyterian church that I met over here in Lexington. Great people. They're part of the CREC. If you know Douglas Wilson and all that controversy with the federal vision and whatnot. But that really didn't come up in the church. It was just a good old Presbyterian church. So I really enjoyed them. I'm thankful for them. To this day, I still consider them friends. Pastor Bobby Beatty is his name. Name of the pastor. Introduced me to a lot of concepts that I'm just thankful for. But so that was my experience, and I was a Presbyterian for over a year and a half, and so that will be the first section. It's 23 minutes, and now I'm going to record another section, and we'll go from there. So 23 minutes. Hope you are motivated to watch the second episode. See you. Bye-bye.